He thought he could outlast us. I don't think he's thinking that right now.
Joe Biden on Vladimir Putin in Kyiv. And to think that a year ago this week, Russian special forces were parachuted into Ukraine's capital to try to capture it. The president of the United States, who ahead of the first anniversary of Vladimir Putin's invasion, made the trip to a war zone. We'll ask about the drama and the logistics of a visit kept secret till Joe Biden was on the ground, a visit punctuated by air raid sirens. How different from a year ago when Biden was derided on the world stage over the U.S.'s messy pullout from Afghanistan. What's standing today? We'll ask about the war effort, Biden's pledges of support in Kyiv, and those of EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels as both Ukrainians and Russians gear up for spring offensives. The U.S. president not the only one on the move after his weekend meeting with Biden's Secretary of State in Munich, China's top diplomat expected in Moscow, as Washington accuses Beijing of considering arms for Putin. What's the score in this superpower standoff over Ukraine? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Joe Biden's visit, and joining us from Kyiv, France 24 correspondent Gulliver Cragg. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you, Francois.
From Berlin, he was the United States' ambassador to Ukraine from 2003 to 2006. John Herbst, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Annick Cizel, Associate Professor in U.S. Foreign Policy at Paris Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Welcome back.
Good evening.
And we're welcome into the studio Stephen Dreyfus, former president of the International Association of Lawyers, making the trek across the Atlantic. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 5 hours in a war zone for a Joe Biden who came to show, as he tweeted, that America and the world stand by Ukraine. James Mulholland has that story.
Under the howl of Kiev's air raid sirens, the most important visit in US-Ukraine relations. That's how Volodymyr Zelensky described the surprise stopover of his US counterpart Joe Biden, which many had been expecting, but that nobody would confirm until after he had arrived. Nearly a year after Russia's invasion, it's an immensely symbolic trip aimed at boosting morale in Ukraine to show its allies and its enemies that the US would honor its pledge of unwavering support for Kiev.
1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you. You and all Ukrainians, Mr. President, remind the world every single day what the meaning of the word courage is.
Security was as heavy as the secrecy surrounding the visit, as Biden and Zelensky paid respect to Ukraine's fallen soldiers. The leader of the world's top military power pledged a further $500 million for heavy munitions, including for HIMARS and howitzers, which Kiev desperately needs. Zelensky thanked Biden and hailed the combined contribution of Western allies to the defense of his country.
This is the most important visit in the history of US-Ukraine relations. It comes at a time when Ukraine is fighting for its own freedom and for the freedom of the world. It underlines what we've achieved on the battlefield and what we can still achieve together with the whole world, with the United States and with Europe.
Biden's visit came ahead of a 3-day trip to Poland, where he hoped to rally more assistance for Ukraine. It coincided with a meeting of EU foreign ministers in Brussels to discuss how to speed up the production of ammunition as Russia intensifies its offensive in the east of Ukraine.
Gulliver Cragg, in the last year, you've seen a lot of foreign leaders come to Kyiv. How dramatic was this Monday morning?
I've actually been quite surprised by just how enthusiastically the Ukrainians received this. Almost the whole of the political class has been tweeting about this being a historic moment. I mean, they're really really delighted the Ukrainians. It's actually, in a way, quite a heartwarming thing to see. I was just watching Ukrainian TV before coming on here, and they had this guy who does an irreverent take on the news, and he was actually speaking in Russian, putting on a kind of not very pleasant Russian accent, showing a picture of Vladimir Putin and saying, "How are you doing, Grandpa? You thought you'd be in Kiev by February the 24th last year, didn't you? Well, look who's here now." I think that actually kind of speaks for the whole nation, that there's really a huge appreciation of the symbolic importance of this trip from the Ukrainian side.
And a certain amount of cloak and dagger, if you will, what with Air Force One being kept far away.
Yeah, I'm not sure I am enough of an expert on the security protocols that are necessary for US leaders to understand exactly why it was necessary to keep this so secret, seeing as they did apparently tell the Kremlin in advance anyway, which makes sense. They said, they didn't want any misunderstanding or any miscalculation to lead to a direct confrontation between the two nuclear powers. So it wasn't to stop the Kremlin from finding out that they had to keep it so secret, but certainly very high security, and a very odd and unprecedented situation where the US president was in town, but there were no Apache helicopters flying overhead. There was a large chunk of the city center closed to traffic. People were requested not to film. Internet, mobile internet and Wi-Fi systems went down in the city center for a certain period of time. So all of that kind of security was in place. But Biden was here to show courage, to, praise the Ukrainians for their courage, and also, I think, to show courage himself and to show determination. An 80-year-old man made a 10-hour journey overland, we think by train, in order to be here. And then, of course, the sirens went off when he was here, and he and Volodymyr Zelensky didn't even flinch at this air raid alert, which presumably the Russians had calculated just in order to scare them or to perhaps disrupt the program. They didn't flinch. They presumably knew that there was no way that the United States were actually going to fire rockets into Kiev while the US president was there. What happens, though, is the air raid sirens have to go off these days when the Russian warplanes fly up in Belarus. These planes may be carrying hypersonic missiles such as the Kinzhal. Sometimes they do. The Ukrainians never take any chances, and the sirens go off when the planes fly up before any missiles have been fired, because the missiles fly so fast it would be too late to wait.
Ambassador Herbst, we know that when it comes to presidential security details, Americans don't do half measures. So how momentous is it that you have Joe Biden going to a war zone? I mean, his predecessors, they've been to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but there, Washington controlled the airspace.
Correct. So this habitual practice to control all elements of security had to be put aside for the president to take this trip. And I think he did it because he saw it as a very important symbolic gesture of his commitment to Ukraine. I think he also was well aware that many of his fellow world leaders have been there, in the case of the Brits, almost a year before. So there's a bit of embarrassment as he took this decision. But he took it, and it's a very good thing that he went.
He took the decision. Your thoughts on how risky was it, really?
I think it was, as it turns out, not very risky at all. We know that his intentions were communicated to the Kremlin, and I think we expected, properly so, that Moscow would not take any measure that in fact could lead to physical harm of the president, because that would greatly increase American intention to make Moscow pay a very high price for this aggression in Ukraine.
All right, I wanted to, what Moscow's reaction will be in the days to come. I wanted to put it to our panel, but first, let's go to eastern Ukraine. France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent is there, our senior correspondent. Catherine, first off, you heard Gulliver Cragg describing elated, ecstatic, the mood in the capital. What about where you are?
Here too, to be said quickly to this far-flung corner of eastern Ukraine. I'm in the Donetsk Oblast, and people here had already heard the news very quickly. Their relatives from other parts of the country had been calling them. They were pretty excited about it, and they saw it as a massive psychological boost, and it really did seem quite a powerful message for the people here in eastern Ukraine, in this part of the country, of course, which has not just been living through 1 year of war since the full-scale invasion, but 9 years now of attritional warfare. So these towns where we've been visiting in the Donetsk Oblast have been used to regular shelling of various intensities. We've been filming in one town which was shelled 3 times in the past week, several civilian lives lost. So it's a hard life here, and a lot of people are feeling the harsh winter here, very low temperatures, the grind of daily life, those who are left. And so this really was a boost for them, and everyone we spoke to was very happy with the news, but they also wanted to know what concretely will come next, because of course there is more military aid attached to this visit, and that's something that people here are really keeping an eye on, because they of course know as much as they can know, given security reasons, about the battle in the east, and they're very worried that they could be next in the line of fire.
Next in the line of fire, and we're going to talk about it in a minute, but a lot of the talk in Brussels among EU foreign ministers this Monday was about bullets. What are the needs where you are?
Well, we were actually with an artillery brigade from the Ukrainian army, and they were telling us they need more ammunition, that they have enough for now, but they could do so much. Just had more stocks coming through. So this is something that's very much playing on their mind. At the moment, they are firing barrages at advancing Russian troops who they say, they see on drone footage coming forward in just waves and drones. But if they go on the attack, perhaps towards the spring, then they tell us they are going to need far more, and they need more Western weapons, because they've got a lot of Soviet-era machinery, they were telling us. They need more ammunition for that, and that's complicated to get because, big exporting countries like Russia or China, they're out of the market for supplying it to Ukraine. So it's a complicated picture, but overall they're just saying, this is really an artillery war at this stage. Of course, that very intense fighting, infantry fighting also going on, especially around Bakhmut. But there's a lot of artillery fire, and they're using up a huge number of shells a day, and they're worried that supplies are not going to last as long as they need them.
Catherine Nordstrom, many thanks for that live update from Donetsk region near the front line. Annick Cizel, lots to unpack in what we've just heard. Let's begin with this visit. I'm trying to think of what the precedent might be. The only thing I could come up with, tell me if I'm wrong, is when the French president, François Mitterrand, went to Sarajevo, what was it, in 1992, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not just the moment which is special, it's the momentum that this trip is bringing to Ukraine, is bringing to the region right now. President Biden is not visiting US troops. This is not Afghanistan or Iraq. He is not even visiting an ally. He is visiting the beacon of freedom, liberty, democracy, territorial sovereignty, the vision for the global order which the Western world is is delivering weapons, ammunition, etc. for. Ukraine is that beacon of that we cannot lose, that Vladimir Putin cannot win this war. So this is a very, very specific moment and momentum, as Vladimir Putin is about to deliver his big speech tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. And most definitely, it's now the President of the United States facing the President of, I was going to say the USSR, because my mind went Putin and went Soviet imperialism over Ukraine, as I was mistaking Russia for the Soviet Union. It's really this face-to-face, visual, symbolic, global face to face that's now taking place over Ukraine, this limited war in Ukraine, but with the rest of the world that's going to be watching Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin facing each other through their speeches.
Yeah, because Monday was Act 1 of the drama. It's going to be a double header on Tuesday, since Joe Biden will also be making a speech in Warsaw.
Absolutely. So it's really that momentum which is being built, and emotionally, the way Joe Biden does it so well, has been doing it so well his entire career. That is, my heart is with Ukraine. I'm embracing Ukraine. He's embracing, literally hugging President Zelensky. The same way he's embracing Ukraine. Been there 6 times as a vice president for Barack Obama, now first time, as definitely the air sirens were off, so were going off. So definitely it's all this emotion, almost watching what was taking place this morning, a celebration, which is, I was thinking about this as I was listening to Gulliver Crag, it's eerie almost. I mean, this country is at war. So many thousands of civilians that have been killed, maimed, etc. And the President of the United States is celebrating the courage, the resilience, the efficiency, the pragmatism of the Ukrainians, how they are standing up for, I guess President Zelensky would be saying, for the civilized world. He's saying it the American way.
Stephen Dreyfus?
Well, I understand that President Biden wanted to create this whole idealistic environment of everything we're doing, but though the rest of the world is watching, the part of the rest of the world that Biden cares about is the American part of the rest of the world. He is just about to announce his candidacy. Starting with the State of the Union address a few weeks ago, he has opened up this new feisty Joe Biden to negate the suggestion that he's too old to run again. And by his showing of courage in going to Ukraine, he's again saying, I'm on top of my game, I'm the leader of the free world, I'm making the United States influence felt. But we all know that American elections are not decided on foreign policy. And the real question is going to be, what do Americans think? Now,
well, this is the interesting bit, because you had on the Sunday morning talk shows, the Republicans we heard were not of the isolationist ilk. We heard the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Now the chairman.
Chairman, excuse me.
Oh, no, I'm saying of the House Foreign Relations Committee.
House Foreign Relations Committee.
It was the chairman.
House Foreign Relations Committee.
Right.
Saying that Biden should go quicker, send the warplanes in.
Well, that's the leadership of the House versus the far right of the House, on which their leadership capacity depends. They only have a 4-vote majority. So you have a situation in which Kevin McCarthy, the new speaker, and his leadership team are emphasizing the traditional Republican values of spreading democracy around the world, being strong, going against the Russians, because to Americans, it may be Russia one day and the Soviet Union before, but it's still the Russians. That's how we have always thought of them. And it's easy to make the Russia an adversary in the United States, easier than it might have been to decide who was really our adversary in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a simple project. And he is showing that he is ready to lead and strong enough to lead and making American presence felt. The latest poll that came out shows that there is still, there's an AP University of Chicago poll that shows that though there's a slight slippage in public opinion in favor of U.S. support of Ukraine, it's not much. It's still better than 3/4 of the people. And that's holding up. And you have, people like McCall and Mike Turner, the head of the chair of the Intelligence Committee, who say that bipartisan support for Ukraine still is strong. So for Biden, it's a win-win. The question is, what difference is it going to make in the war? It's very interesting that at the Munich Security Conference, when all the European countries were sending their chief of state, their president, Macron was there and Scholz was there, he sent Kamala Harris. He didn't go himself. One, to try to give some credibility to Kamala Harris, who's been under attack by some Democrats as being perhaps not the strongest candidate to join him in the re-election campaign, but also to give a separate kind of a separation for him for this trip and for the speech he's going to make in Warsaw tomorrow, so that there would be some identification of something special by the American president. And at the same time, you have this struggle between, for example, Macron and Scholz for leadership of the European Union.
We'll get back to that point about Macron and Scholz. John Herbst, since you've seen already and reread Biden's speech for tomorrow, you can, I'm sure, tell us what's in it. What message should he be sending out this Tuesday?
I'm afraid I'm not quite cheerleading for the Biden administration and for this trip. I think our policy, American policy, has been essential to stopping Putin from getting a victory his first year of this war. And for that, it deserves praise. I would call it fully adequate to that challenge, but not more than adequate. It has been workmanlike and not visionary. And reasons for that have been evident in this conversation to date. Our stated goal, to the extent that we can find it, is to stay with Ukraine as long as it takes. What does that mean? I know why we should be doing what we're doing, because Putin's revanchist foreign policy does not end at Ukraine's western border. His statements, those draft treaties that were sent to the US and to NATO in December of 2021, numerous Kremlin statements and activities indicate he has his eyes set on undermining NATO. He said that he wants to have effective political control in all the countries that used to make up the former Soviet Union, which includes 3 NATO allies. And American security, American prosperity is based upon a strong NATO. So Putin is threatening that. And the president should be able to say that clearly. Those are the words of a statesman. And consistent with that, a statesman would pursue strong policies that would more quickly achieve those objectives. And we've already heard, you might say, in the conversation to date, what those policies are. Giving Ukraine the weapons it needs to effectively defeat Moscow and Ukraine. That would include sending our Abrams tanks not via a slow boat, which gets them there at the end of this calendar year, but directly so they arrive in a couple of months. Sending the F-16s, sending the long-range artillery that would immediately stop the Russian offensive, the bloody and not very successful Russian offensive around Bakhmut. And most importantly, would enable Ukraine to cut the land bridge from Russia through Donbass to Crimea that could be the decisive military engagement of the war. We're not hearing that. The Biden trip.
But isn't the reason you're not hearing that is because you want to raise the ante slowly? After all, you are dealing with nuclear-armed Russia here.
I'm glad you raised that. The administration has not been pursuing a mature or sensible policy on nuclear intimidation. They've in fact been intimidated by Putin's constant use of the nuclear threat, despite the fact he's threatened it many times and never delivered on his red lines. And a great power like the United States has nukes too. And those nukes are every bit as dangerous to Russia as Russian nukes are to us. And even former Russian officials like Dmitry Trenin, who used to be an FSB officer, and Lieutenant General Brzezinski have said publicly, of course, Russia would only use nukes if in fact NATO were to be attacking Russia. But we've let ourselves be cautioned, intimidated. We have self-deterred because of those threats. That didn't happen under Kennedy. It didn't happen in the past when we faced a more powerful adversary. And we never, ever said, we can't do X because they have nukes. That's not the talk of a superpower. And so that's been a clear weakness of this administration. And that's why many people, many commentators raise this, because the administration is not pursuing a policy of strength and vision that was a hallmark of bipartisan American foreign policy during the Cold War.
The question is why?
Annick Cizel, you heard John Herbst there. Even Joe Biden, the veteran Cold Warrior, doesn't know how to speak the language of deterrence in 2023?
Well, most definitely the Bucharest Nine, who are going to meet around Jens Stoltenberg tomorrow, starting tomorrow at least, in Poland, in the presence of the President of the United States.
These are NATO countries.
The central and eastern flank of Europe NATO members are meeting tomorrow in Poland. This has been announced by NATO, which means that there's the discourse, the Biden discourse for the American people, as was being said on the set. This was today. These were the pictures, the embraces. But then tomorrow, business starts again. And let's not forget that in the past couple of weeks, we've seen Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in Ramstein. We've seen Antony Blinken, Secretary of State. We've seen now, this is the tradition for the Munich Security Conference, that the Vice President was present in Europe with a bipartisan, bicameral delegation with her, which she said was the strongest ever following for the Munich, this European, the heart of
So you don't agree with John Herbst? He is speaking the language of deterrence.
Exactly. The entire administration's been coming over in the past couple of weeks in order to say, this is a priority. We are talking seriously to Russia. Strongly to Russia.
I want to get back to something that was said earlier by our correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent, who is in the east of Ukraine, about that need for bullets. While Biden was in Kyiv this Monday, EU foreign ministers were in Brussels discussing a joint procurement scheme. It's along the lines of, those pooled COVID vaccine purchases we had a couple of years back, only this time it would be bullets for Ukraine. Gulliver Cragg, your thoughts on how fast things are going, how deliberately they're going?
Well, I understand Pakistan recently said it would provide a lot of ammunition to Ukraine, I presume funded by the United States. So there are countries that are not necessarily particularly aligned in this conflict, or are not raging cheerleaders for Ukraine in any case, that are perhaps prepared to provide the necessary supplies if the price is right. So that's perhaps something that we'll be observing more of going forward. Just listening to John Herbst, though, it struck me that in a way, some of the Ukrainian political classes' reactions to Joe Biden's visit today smack a little bit of wishful thinking to some degree, because they kind of react and say, Biden, one of them was saying, Biden is here, and I can't remember his exact words, but this was Mikhailo Podolyak, the top advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky, that Joe Biden's here expressing his support for the ultimate destruction of Russia, or something like that. Don't quote me exactly verbatim that this was exactly what he said. Others were saying that the United States absolutely supports Ukraine's intention to take back Crimea by force. And while Joe Biden does say that the United States supports Ukraine for as long as it takes, and Ukraine explicitly says we are going to take back Crimea, you won't find US officials stating quite as clearly, as black and white as that the United States will support Ukraine all the way towards an attempt to take back Crimea by military force. I think that is something about which there is a lot more doubt, not only in America, but also and more so among the European allies of Ukraine.
Yeah, and we had a taste of that because we had a strong speech by the French president at that Munich Security Conference last week. And then, in an interview on his way home, Emmanuel Macron again insisting on the importance of, quote, not humiliating Russia. Let's listen.
I do not think, as some people do, that we must aim for a total defeat of Russia, attacking Russia on its own soil. Those observers want to, above all else, crush Russia. That has never been the position of France, and it will never be our position.
Yeah. Okay, Ukraine's president quick to respond in an interview with the Corriere della Sera, Volodymyr Zelensky stating Macron is wasting his time, Stephen Dreyfus.
Well, I mean, Macron is doing his at the same time approach to this the same way he did when he said humiliate. Now he's saying we don't want to crush them, as if that was any different. What I don't understand, and I'm in agreement with the ambassador on this, I don't understand why they're dragging their feet. There was an extraordinary speech by Josep Borrell in Munich, in which
EU foreign policy chief.
Yes, in which he criticized the slow speed with which the Leopard tanks were provided, and
the German Leopard tanks.
The German Leopard tanks and the Leopard tanks from the Allies who had them, and for a long time were not being allowed to send them by the Germans until the Americans committed the Abrams tanks. But the question is, I mean, right now, Poland has 48 F-16s. And Poland has said that we'll be glad to send those F-16s to Ukraine if the Americans will backfill our supply of F-16s. We're not asking the Americans to send them to Ukraine. Just give us back the ones that we send to Ukraine. And the Biden administration is not doing it. I don't understand the reason for this kind of reluctance.
Annick Cizel has the answer.
I sure don't. Escalation is the word that comes to mind. I sure don't, because so many things are happening at the same time. Because you have Antony Blinken at the same time saying China is about to send weapons to enter this escalatory, if I try to speak like the French president, this escalation of arming either side. And at the same time, you have this capacity for this limited war to really enter the danger zone when it becomes so global in who's supporting which side, not just Iran and North Korea supporting Russia. But if China were to step in, definitely we're changing the scale of this limited war. And sending
So mission creep on all sides.
Well, but the Chinese sent a very clear message that there should not be the use of nuclear weapons by anybody. They said it again a couple of days ago.
And at the same time, Antony Blinken was in Turkey talking humanitarian disaster assistance. At the same time as the Turkish government is pushing for the F-16s on their side.
Yes.
And the US Congress has been saying no F-16s unless you're letting Finland and Sweden enter NATO. I hope our audience can follow what I'm saying right now. What I'm saying is I'm taking no bets, but something major is being negotiated behind the scenes right now. Maybe we'll see the F-16s for Ukraine in the next couple of days.
All right, more than two superpowers in this mix, as Annick is saying, after sitting down with his U.S. counterpart on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference this past week. China's top diplomat Wang Yi expected in Moscow via Budapest this Monday. This after Antony Blinken warned China against arming the Russians, a warning reiterated during that U.S. Secretary of State visit to Turkey.
I'm not going to lay out what the consequences would be. I shared these concerns directly with the senior Chinese foreign policy official Wang Yi when I saw him at the Munich Security Conference just the other day. But I think China understands what's at risk were it to proceed with providing material support of that kind to Russia.
John Herbst, if we look back on the past year, China, which has so far tread very cautiously, would they suddenly go all in behind Russia?
I expect not. What we've seen is she has been disappointed, though perhaps not as highly disappointed by the failure of Russian arms as Putin. And we saw that in that peculiar meeting between Xi and Putin in Uzbekistan in the fall, where Putin was kind of publicly apologizing for his performance in Ukraine. And then we saw it when Scholz went to China this past winter, and China made clear, no talk of nuclear escalation. And as mentioned already on this program, that was repeated recently. So China's been careful to stay away from crossing American red or reddish yellow lines that could lead to sanctions. And I think that will continue. But thinking is not certain. We now have talk of a Chinese diplomatic initiative, which would definitely not be helpful. And we have, talk about, I think that Blinken probably is reporting something that our intelligence is picking up about the Chinese considering it, probably to see what our reaction is. So I would praise the administration for Blinken's warning to China, just as they did very well laying out what Moscow was planning to do before the big invasion.
Stephen Dreyfus?
I certainly agree with that. I don't understand exactly why they. We have the mantra of Biden has always been a dual mantra about Ukraine. He said, as long as it takes, whatever it takes, as long as it takes. And the other thing he's always said is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And that has really generated the concern about the blank check. Because if you really believe nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, then you have to go along with the insistence on the return of Crimea, because the Ukrainians want that. if we are not prepared to take a position as to what is a reasonable exit, then we are effectively writing a blank check. And as we get closer to 2024, it will be more and more difficult for Biden, the candidate, to maintain that mentality when we've given, $110 billion in aid so far, of which more than 50 billion is military. He just announced another $500 million today or yesterday. So there has to be a limit, and the Republicans are ready to jump on it when it gets closer to election time.
Gulliver Cragg, after Joe Biden's visit to Kyiv this Monday, ahead of his speech in Warsaw on Tuesday, is the U.S. president closer to the position of his Ukrainian counterpart or to France's Emmanuel Macron when you read that interview in Le Journal du Dimanche?
Well, I think that these discrepancies are definitely discrepancies that perhaps deserve closer attention because, yeah, you've got Emmanuel Macron saying that Russia must not be crushed and that has never been and never will be the position of France. Although we remember that Joe Biden did at some point say of Vladimir Putin, this man cannot remain in power, he was very, very soon afterwards required to backpedal on that. And that is not explicitly the position of the United States at all. And the world needs to bear in mind that while it may not be the explicitly articulated position of Volodymyr Zelensky, it is the hope of millions of Ukrainians and the explicitly expressed wish of numbers of Ukrainian politicians, including very high-ranking politicians such as Alexei Danilov, the secretary of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council, that Russia be crushed, dismembered, that it break apart, at the very, very least, at a minimum, that Vladimir Putin no longer be in power. And I think a lot of Ukrainians have difficulty imagining how they could in any way feel secure or that justice has been done if Vladimir Putin remains in power and if Russia is not, in some way seen to be humiliated or crushed. It's important to stress they did not feel this way before the 24th of February 2022. Vladimir Putin's claims that Russia was under threat from Ukraine before then were completely spurious. That's changed now. That's what Ukrainians want now. And if Macron is right when he says that the alternatives to Putin are all worse than that, then, one really has to hope that the French, the Americans and others have been thinking out the various scenarios of in what way could Putin possibly stay in power and Russia stay in its current form with the Ukrainians being somehow satisfied or reassured? Or if that's not to happen, what are the different scenarios that could pan out? I mean, I think that it's quite hard to imagine, and none of them at all seem really in any way reassuring, I'm afraid to say.
Well, John Herbst, politicians like to play to their audience. When he's in Warsaw, the U.S. president will be before an audience of hawks. Will Biden be tempted to employ the kind of language that Gulliver described, the one where he said this man, speaking of Vladimir Putin, must not remain in power?
Well, you've already anticipated part of the answer. I mean, the answer is we've seen that before in the same location, so it's quite possible we'll see it again. But when we saw that before, we also saw another walk back by White House staff of what President Biden said. So we might see that too if this happens. I would hope, but I can't say I am expecting, a strong statement by the president designed as much for the American people as for everybody else. That, again, we have vital interest in ensuring Putin's defeat, and we will speed up our timetable to provide the things Ukraine needs to do that. And also, since we now know a lot more about what great power war means today, we will hasten something we began almost a year ago but have done very little since, which is to increase substantially American military production, not just to ensure that we can provide Ukraine what it needs, but to make sure that we have what we need and our allies have what they need, looking towards possible confrontations, whether it's with Russia in the future or with China. That's what a statesman does.
Annick Cizel, again, we're coming up to Friday's anniversary of Vladimir Putin's attempt to seize the Ukrainian capital. And you think back to a year ago, the U.S. president on the world stage was in low standing. I mean, the U.S. had to leave with its, after that messy pullout from Afghanistan. Now you're hearing John Herbst talking about how the United States has to effectively quarterback the security and defense of much more than just his own country now.
Except that most definitely, but the United States pulled out of Afghanistan in order to redeploy, and now we know where. That is, in case things were going out of hand on the European front or in the Indo-Pacific. The United States needed this capability to keep its military bases in Europe, beef them up, and intervene if need be.
So what's the U.S.'s standing among Europeans, among French people now, today compared to a year ago?
Difficult question. Thanks for the question. I think standing by Ukraine remains a top priority for most Europeans among the population right now. And as long as the United States plays the game within NATO, with European defense inside of NATO, as long as the Weimar Triangle of Poland, Germany, and France, who spoke together at the end of the Munich Security Conference, as long as the United States acknowledges this, that is, doesn't try to talk to Poland, hard talk, and then leaving aside France and Germany, who are anticipating 2024 and a potential non-Biden re-election in 2024, where do we take European defense from there? As long as we don't have Western Europe against Eastern Europe in Washington's minds, then I guess it's European defense within NATO under US leadership, because the capability is in the United States, and this can go along. But
there's one big winner in Europe in all this, and it's Poland. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that Joe Biden was calling Poland, Belarus, and Hungary examples of the, quote, the rise of totalitarian regimes in the world. And the European Union was getting ready to use Article 7 of the treaty to strip Poland and Hungary of their votes, of their right to vote, because of the attacks on judicial independence, notably in Poland. Now, all of a sudden, Poland is the darling of the American administration. He's giving them a big gift to the Law and Justice Party by going there to make this big speech tomorrow. And already the more hawkish parts of that party are announcing that this is a great victory for their party and vindication of their leadership. So
they might say that, but I mean, the European Commission hasn't given up on its criticisms of Poland for all of those reasons. And there's elections due in Poland this autumn, which the opinion polls currently suggest the Law and Justice Party is going to lose.
Well, it may be, but right now, Viktor Orban is more and more isolated as about the only country left in Europe now of this authoritarian bloc who is even overtly and perhaps certainly subtly supporting the Russians. And
opposing Finland and Sweden into NATO.
You know, because if you look at the list of Putin's miscalculations, in addition to the not being able to take over Ukraine in a matter of weeks, he has succeeded in getting Finland and Sweden to decide to want to join NATO. He's unified NATO between East and West, which it wasn't before. And he has isolated the one sympathizer that he has in the European Union, which is Viktor Orban, even more than he ever was. So Biden is giving a big gift, and we're hearing very little about human rights. We're hearing very little from the left side of the Democratic Party about their complaints about authoritarianism in Europe, because there's a greater good. And the greater good, I mean, for the United States is if we have NATO, we're fighting here so that we don't have to fight on our shores in the end. And that's what the American purpose has always been in using NATO.
Gulliver Cragg, we're out of time, but has the so-called offensive begun or not yet?
The U.S. analyst I find the most reliable, Michael Kaufman, very much thinks that the offensive has begun and that this is it, the Russian offensive in Donbass.
we'll continue, of course, to monitor it, and lots of programming to come this week in the build-up to that first anniversary. Gulliver Cragg in Kyiv, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank John Herbst in Berlin, Annick Cizel, Stephen Dreyfus, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.